Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something pretty wild, the American frontier. Not the sanitized version you learned in school, but the real gritty, sometimes filthy truth about how people survived on the edge of civilization. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to the American frontier and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So, congratulations. You just woke up in a one-room log cabin somewhere on the American frontier around 1790. Your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the oiled paper window. No glass here, that's a luxury few can afford. You're lying on a corn husk mattress on a simple wooden frame, and it crackles softly as you shift. The rough-hewn logs of the walls still smell of pine sap, sweet and sharp in the morning air. Your bare feet touch the packed dirt floor, cool against your skin. Outside, you hear the distant crow of a rooster and the snort of a pig rooting around near the cabin. The smell of wood smoke hangs in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of last night's beans still lingering in the cast-iron pot, hanging over the cold hearth. This is the American frontier, and in less than 70 years, the United States will expand from the original 13 colonies covering about 300,000 square miles to a massive nation spanning 2.8 million square miles of continental territory. It's one of the largest, fastest land grabs in human history, and you, my friend, are about to experience what it was really like to live through it. The good news is you're about to witness one of the most remarkable periods of exploration and settlement in history. The bad news? It's going to be brutal, like seriously brutal. The American frontier wasn't just hard, it was deadly. The period was marked by near-continuous warfare, often in impossible terrain with weather that could kill you as quickly as any human enemy. It took a certain kind of crazy to survive out here. You pull a rough woolen shirt over your head. The fabric is scratchy against your skin, hand-spun and dyed with walnut husks to a muddy brown. No fancy colours out here. You work with what nature provides. Your pants are buckskin, soft from years of wear, patched at the knees where they've worn thin. As you step outside, the morning mist clings to the fields beyond your cabin. Your nearest neighbour is 3 miles away. The forest edge looms dark and mysterious, just 50 yards from your door. That forest contains deer and turkey for food, but also wolves, bears, and sometimes hostile Native Americans who, let's be honest, have pretty good reasons to be upset about you settling on their land. You settle deeper into your bed as we journey back to those wild days. Your muscles relax a bit more as the story unfolds. Now, let me tell you about one of the most famous frontiersmen to ever live, a man whose life reads like an action movie script but was somehow even wilder in reality. Daniel Boone. You've probably heard the name, maybe pictured him in a coonskin cap, though he actually preferred wide-brimmed felt hats. Daniel Boone was a legendary frontiersman who became immortalized through books and movies. He helped open up the American frontier during the Revolutionary War when he discovered the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. He blazed the Wilderness Road, another key passageway into the West. Through it all, he had some pretty crazy adventures. Born in 1734 in Pennsylvania to a Quaker family, Boone grew up learning to hunt almost as soon as he could walk. Instead of going to school, young Daniel would disappear into the woods for days at a time, living off the land and learning the ways of the wilderness. By the time he was a teenager, he could track a deer for miles by noticing bent grass stems or a single displaced pebble. He could move so quietly through the forest that animals wouldn't notice him until his rifle was already aimed. The Boone family eventually moved to North Carolina, where Daniel met his wife, Rebecca. She was quite a woman herself, tough as nails and fully capable of defending their homestead with a rifle when Daniel was away on his many expeditions. They had 10 children together, which was actually pretty standard for the time. More kids meant more hands to work the land and better chances that at least some would survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was horrifyingly high on the frontier. Nearly 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. But one of Boone's most dramatic adventures was straight out of a Hollywood thriller. It was 1776. Boone had established the town of Boonesborough a year earlier, and the Revolutionary War was in full swing. In July, Boone's daughter Jemima, who was just 14 years old at the time, was taken captive along with 2 other young women, Betsy and Fanny Calloway. The girls were down by the river doing laundry and talking about whatever teenage girls talked about in 1776. Probably complaining about churning butter and speculating about which local boy might make a good husband someday. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. A group of Shawnee warriors had been sent by the British to harass and attack American settlers in Kentucky. The British were desperate to maintain control of the frontier and were actively encouraging Native American tribes to fight against the American revolutionaries. The Shawnee spotted the 3 girls and saw an opportunity. They silently paddled their canoes across the river, grabbed the girls, and disappeared into the forest before anyone in Boonesborough even realized what had happened. Can you imagine the panic? 3 teenage girls suddenly gone, with only overturned wash baskets and footprints leading into the wilderness as evidence of what happened. When Boone learned that his daughter had been kidnapped, he wasn't just upset, he was furious and determined. Boone gathered a group of men, including the fathers of the other 2 girls, and they immediately set out in pursuit. This wasn't just a father trying to save his daughter, this was Daniel Boone, one of the greatest trackers and woodsmen in American history, using every skill he had developed over decades in the wilderness. The Shawnee had a significant head start and were moving fast, but they didn't know they were being pursued by Boone. The warriors were taking the girls to a Shawnee village near present-day Chillicothe, Ohio, about 160 miles away. That's a long way to travel on foot through dense forest and across rivers. Boone and his rescue party followed the trail, moving as quickly as they dared while still being careful not to lose the tracks. They pushed through dense underbrush, forded streams, and climbed steep hills. The men barely stopped to rest, eating dried venison and cornmeal as they walked. At night, they would take turns sleeping for just a few hours while others kept watch. The Shawnee were clever, though. They tried several tricks to lose their pursuers, doubling back on their trail, walking through streams to hide their footprints, and splitting up temporarily before rejoining. But Boone was smarter. He could read the forest like you read words on a page. A broken twig, a disturbed stone, a faint footprint in moss. All of these told him exactly where the Shawnee were heading. After 3 days of relentless tracking, Boone and his men caught up with the Shawnee party. They found them making camp for the evening, the 3 girls sitting together, tired and frightened but unharmed. Boone knew they had to be careful. Rush in too quickly and the Shawnee might harm the girls. So they waited, hidden in the trees, watching the camp as darkness fell. The Shawnee built a fire and cooked a meal, unaware that Boone and his men were surrounding them, inching closer as the night deepened. When most of the warriors seemed to be sleeping, with just 2 keeping watch, Boone gave the signal. The rescue party burst into the camp from all directions at once, firing their long rifles and charging with tomahawks and knives. The surprise was complete. Several Shawnee warriors fell in the first volley of shots, and the others fled into the darkness, leaving everything behind, including the 3 girls. Jemima ran to her father, throwing her arms around him in relief. Within minutes, the rescue party gathered the girls and began the long journey back to Boonesboro. This dramatic rescue became one of the most famous stories of the frontier. It was later loosely adapted into James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans, though Cooper changed many of the details. The real story of a father tracking kidnappers through 160 miles of wilderness to rescue his daughter was remarkable enough without embellishment. You might be thinking this sounds like the movie Taken, but with buckskin instead of a leather jacket, and you'd be right. Daniel Boone had a very particular set of skills he had acquired over a very long career as a frontiersman, skills that made him a nightmare for people who messed with his family. But Boone's adventures didn't end there. Just 2 years later, in 1778, the tables would turn dramatically. The Revolutionary War was raging, and the British had teamed up with several Native American tribes to attack American frontier settlements. In September 1778, a large force of Shawnee warriors, led by Chief Blackfish with the support of British officers, surrounded Boonesboro. The siege of Boonesboro began with the Shawnee taking positions around the fort, cutting off any escape routes. Inside the fort, Boone and the other settlers prepared for a fight. Women melted down pewter plates and cups to make bullets. Children carried water from the fort's well to put out any fires that might start. Men checked their rifles and positioned themselves at the walls. The settlers were outnumbered and outgunned, but their fort was solid, built from sturdy logs with a palisade wall surrounding it. The Shawnee tried several tactics to get inside. They shot flaming arrows onto the roofs, hoping to set the buildings on fire. They tried to tunnel under the walls. They even attempted to talk their way in by offering peace terms. But despite their best efforts, the settlers held the fort. Days turned into weeks, and supplies inside Boonesboro began to run low. Ammunition was scarce, food was being carefully rationed, and tempers were fraying from the constant stress of being under siege. The situation became even more desperate when several enslaved men who had been fighting alongside the settlers, because yes, even frontier heroes like Daniel Boone participated in the brutal practice of slavery, defected to the Shawnee, taking with them much-needed ammunition and information about the fort's weaknesses. Eventually, after nearly 2 weeks of siege, the settlers were forced to negotiate with the Shawnee. Boone, knowing the tribe's language and customs from previous encounters, led the negotiations. But it was a trap. During the talks, the Shawnee attempted to seize Boone and the other negotiators. A fight broke out, and the settlers barely made it back inside the fort. The siege continued for several more days, but the Shawnee, having failed to take the fort by force or trickery, eventually withdrew. Boonesboro had survived, but the victory came at a cost. Several settlers had been killed or wounded, and the fort's supplies were nearly exhausted. This wasn't the end of Boone's interactions with the Shawnee, though. Earlier that same year, before the siege, Boone had been captured by the Shawnee while on a salt-making expedition. Instead of killing him, Chief Blackfish decided to adopt Boone into the tribe. It was a common practice among many Native American tribes to adopt captives to replace family members who had died. Boone was given the name Sheltowee, which means Big Turtle, and he lived with the Shawnee for several months. During this time, he learned their language and customs, hunted with them, and participated in tribal life. Some historians believe that Boone deliberately ingratiated himself with the Shawnee as a survival strategy, planning his escape all along. Others suggest that he genuinely appreciated aspects of their culture and way of life. Either way, when Boone learned that the Shawnee were planning a major attack on Boonesboro, he decided it was time to leave. early one morning, he slipped away from the village and began a daring journey back to warn the settlers. He covered 160 miles in just 4 days, an incredible feat of endurance through rough wilderness. You shift a bit in your bed, finding that perfect position as your breathing naturally slows, and we continue our journey through the American frontier. Your muscles relax as we follow the path of another famous frontiersman whose life was just as dramatic and whose legacy would become even more legendary. The story continues with a man who went from the wilderness to Washington and back again, ending at a small mission called the Alamo. As your muscles continue to relax into your comfortable bed, we turn our attention to another legendary frontiersman. This man went from hunting bears and living off the land to standing in the halls of Congress, arguing with presidents, and eventually dying for a cause he believed in. Davy Crockett. Even his name sounds like it was made for legends. Unlike Daniel Boone, who was born before the American Revolution, Davy Crockett came into the world as a citizen of the brand new United States. He was born on August 17, 1786, in eastern Tennessee, which was then part of North Carolina. His parents were poor farmers living in a tiny cabin, not much different from the one you imagined waking up in earlier. The Crockett family's cabin was a simple one-room structure with a dirt floor and a leaky roof. At night, young Davy would lie on his straw pallet and watch the stars through the gaps in the roof. In winter, snow would sometimes drift in through those same gaps, dusting the sleeping children with white. The cabin was crowded with Davy's 8 siblings, so privacy was non-existent. Everyone ate, slept, and lived in that single room, with only the glow of the hearth fire for warmth and light. Davy's childhood wasn't easy. His father, John Crockett, struggled to make ends meet and was often in debt. When Davy was just 12 years old, his father hired him out to a cattle drover to help pay off a debt. Imagine that, 12 years old and sent off with strangers to drive cattle hundreds of miles through wilderness. That was life on the frontier. The cattle drive was brutal. Young Davy walked alongside the lowing herd from sunrise to sunset, his feet blistered and bleeding in his worn-out moccasins. At night, he'd collapse by the campfire, too exhausted to do more than choke down a bit of cornmeal mush before falling into dreamless sleep. The rain soaked him, the sun burned him, and the mosquitoes feasted on him. But he endured. When the cattle drive ended, Davy was supposed to return home. Instead, he found himself abandoned in a strange town, hundreds of miles from his family, with no money and no way to get back. Many children in his situation might have given up, not Davy Crockett. He worked odd jobs, saving every penny. He slept in barns and stables or under the stars when the weather allowed. He ate whatever he could find or earn, sometimes just a handful of nuts or berries from the forest edge, and slowly, over the course of 2 years, he made his way back home to Tennessee. This early hardship shaped Crockett into a resilient, self-reliant young man. By the time he was 18, he had struck out on his own, working as a cattle driver, guiding herds of livestock through the wilderness to markets in Virginia and Georgia. He quickly gained a reputation as a skilled frontiersman and hunter, known for his sharpshooting skills and ability to survive in the wilderness. You adjust your pillow, feeling the soft fabric against your cheek as you settle in. The weight of your blankets feels just right, not too heavy, not too light, just comfortable, just perfect. Now, there's one story about Davy Crockett that sounds like it came straight from the movie The Revenant, but it happened about 200 years earlier. In the fall of 1825, Crockett was out hunting in the woods near his home in Tennessee. The forest was alive with autumn colors, red maples, golden hickories, and deep green pines. The ground was soft underfoot, cushioned with decades of fallen leaves and pine needles. The air was crisp, carrying the musky scent of decaying vegetation and the distinctive smell of approaching winter. Crockett was tracking a deer moving silently through the underbrush when he came across a large black bear instead. Now, an American black bear can weigh up to 600 pounds and stand over 6 feet tall on its hind legs. This was not a creature to be taken lightly. Crockett raised his rifle and fired a shot at the bear. The sound cracked through the forest like thunder, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. But the bear was so big and so close that the single shot wasn't enough to bring it down. Instead, it charged straight at Crockett, covering the distance between them in seconds. The massive animal knocked Crockett to the ground with a swipe of its powerful paw. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent his rifle spinning away into the leaves. The bear's hot breath washed over him, smelling of raw meat and wild animal. Its weight pressed down on his chest, nearly crushing him. In that moment, many men would have given up, but Davy Crockett wasn't most men. He managed to draw his hunting knife from his belt and engaged in a hand-to-hand struggle with the bear. Man and beast rolled across the forest floor, locked in a desperate battle for survival. Crockett stabbed at the bear repeatedly, the blade sinking into thick fur and fat. The bear roared in pain and fury, its claws raking across Crockett's body, tearing his buckskin clothing and the skin beneath. Blood, both human and ursine, soaked into the forest floor. For several minutes the outcome hung in the balance. Then, finally, one of Crockett's knife thrusts found the bear's heart. The massive animal shuddered, gave a final growl, and collapsed. Crockett lay beside the dead bear, gasping for breath, his body a mass of cuts and bruises. His leg was broken, and he was miles from the nearest settlement. Somehow he managed to drag himself to a creek where he washed his wounds as best he could. Then, using his rifle as a crutch, he began the painful journey home. It took him nearly 2 days to cover a distance he normally would have walked in a few hours. By the time he reached his cabin, he was delirious with pain and fever. His wife treated his wounds with poultices of herbs and wrapped his broken leg with strips of cloth. For weeks, he hovered between life and death, fighting off infection without the benefit of modern antibiotics. But like so many times before, Davy Crockett survived. Whether this exact bear story is true or embellished isn't really the point. Crockett was building up a legendary persona that would eventually propel him into politics and the national spotlight. And it worked. In 1827, he was elected to the Tennessee state legislature, and in 1827, he won a seat in the United States House of Representatives. Imagine the scene. Davy Crockett, dressed in his frontier clothing, walking into the hallowed halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. While other congressmen wore fine suits and silk cravats, Crockett often appeared in his buckskin jacket, looking more like he belonged in the forest than in the Capitol. He spoke plainly without the flowery language favoured by many politicians of the day, and people loved him for it. A piece of publicity that helped rocket, you see what I did there, Crockett into the national spotlight was a play called The Lion of the West. The play's main character wasn't named Davy Crockett, but he looked and acted a whole lot like the frontiersman. In this satirical comedy that poked fun at frontier life and politics, Crockett was portrayed as a larger-than-life figure, full of bluster and braggadocio, but also with a heart of gold. The character's homespun humour and folksy charm resonated with audiences across the country and helped to cement Crockett's status as an American icon. The play was also significant because it coincided with the rise of Andrew Jackson, another frontier figure who had become president in 1829. Crockett was initially a strong supporter of Jackson. Both men were from Tennessee, both had fought against Native American tribes, and both presented themselves as men of the people rather than elite politicians, but their alliance wouldn't last. During his time as a US representative from 1827 to 1835, Davy Crockett became increasingly frustrated with the political process in Washington. He was a member of the Whig Party, but he often clashed with party leaders and disagreed with their policies. One of Crockett's main frustrations was with what he saw as excessive government spending. He believed that the federal government was becoming too powerful and that it was wasting taxpayer money on unnecessary projects. He became particularly critical of President Jackson, despite the fact that the two were pretty good friends and allies initially. You take a deeper breath, feeling your belly rise and fall. The rhythm of your breathing naturally slows as you listen to the story unfold. Your shoulders sink just a little deeper into the mattress. The final straw that led to Crockett eventually leaving Congress and heading to Texas was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This legislation, strongly supported by President Jackson, authorized the president to negotiate with southern Native American tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River in exchange for their homeland in the southeast. Crockett actually supported the act at first. He figured that the relocation would be beneficial for the Native Americans since they'd be removed from the influence of white settlers and given new land to cultivate. He also saw it as a way to open up new land for white settlement and to further expand the United States. But as the debate over the Indian Removal Act continued, Crockett started having doubts. He received letters from his constituents expressing opposition to the forced removal of the Cherokee people who were living in his home state of Tennessee. Many of these Cherokee had adopted European-style farming practices, built permanent homes, and even created their own written language. Some had converted to Christianity and were living in ways very similar to their white neighbours. The more Crockett learned about the situation, the more uncomfortable he became with the idea of forcing these people from their ancestral lands. He began to see the Indian Removal Act as a betrayal of American principles of justice and fair treatment. In a famous speech to Congress, Crockett declared that the Indian Removal Act was unjust and that the government had no right to force Native Americans from their land. He argued that the Cherokee people had a right to their ancestral homeland and that they should be allowed to stay. "I would sooner be honestly damned than hypocritically immortalized," he reportedly said, indicating that he would rather lose his political career than support a policy he believed was wrong. Despite his opposition, the act was ultimately passed, which led to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans on what became known as the Trail of Tears. The journey was brutal. Of the approximately 16,000 Cherokee who were removed from their homes, about 4,000 died from exposure, disease, and starvation during the forced march. Disillusioned and angry, Davy Crockett decided not to run for re-election to Congress in 1835. Instead, he famously told his constituents, "You may all go to hell and I will go to Texas," and that's exactly what he did. Texas in the 1830s was part of Mexico, but it had a growing population of American settlers who were chafing under Mexican rule. These settlers, along with some Mexican citizens, were pushing for independence from Mexico. When Crockett arrived in San Antonio in early 1836, he joined a group of volunteers defending the Alamo, an old Spanish mission that had been converted into a fortress. The Alamo wasn't much to look at, just a crumbling stone building with a small courtyard surrounded by a low wall. It was never designed to withstand a military siege, but it was what the Texians, as they called themselves, had, so they made the best of it. Crockett and his fellow defenders, which included some famous frontiersmen in their own right, including Jim Bowie of Bowie knife fame, faced off against a Mexican army led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The siege of the Alamo lasted for 13 days, with Crockett and the Texians holding out against overwhelming odds. Inside the Alamo, conditions quickly deteriorated. Food was scarce, water had to be hauled from a nearby well under enemy fire, and ammunition was running low. The defenders took turns sleeping in shifts, their rest frequently interrupted by Mexican cannon fire or false alarms of an imminent attack. Crockett, despite being new to the Texian cause, quickly became a leader among the defenders. His experience as a frontiersman and his natural charisma made him someone the others looked to for guidance and courage. He was often seen patrolling the walls, his trusty rifle, Betsy, in hand, offering words of encouragement to the younger, less experienced fighters. In the pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, after nearly 2 weeks of siege, the Mexican forces launched their final assault on the Alamo. The sound of drums and bugles broke the night's silence as thousands of Mexican soldiers advanced toward the mission's walls from all sides. The Texian defenders rushed to their positions, firing their rifles and cannons into the advancing Mexican ranks. The air filled with gun smoke and the deafening roar of cannon fire. Men shouted orders and cries of pain as bullets found their marks. You feel your body getting heavier, more comfortable with each breath. The tension in your muscles continues to melt away as you listen to the story. Your eyelids might feel a bit heavier, but they're still open, still following along with the tale of Davy Crockett's last stand. The final battle lasted less than 2 hours. The Mexican forces, despite heavy casualties, managed to breach the walls of the Alamo. The fighting then devolved into a desperate room-by-room struggle as the defenders made their last stand. It's not entirely certain how Crockett died. Some accounts say he was among the last defenders, fighting until he was overwhelmed by Mexican soldiers. Others suggest that he and a few remaining men surrendered and were executed soon after. A third version claims he died fighting in the courtyard, surrounded by the bodies of Mexican soldiers he had killed. Whatever the exact circumstances of his death, Davy Crockett's legend only grew after the fall of the Alamo. He became a symbol of American courage and determination, a frontier hero who stood up for what he believed was right, even when it cost him his political career and, ultimately, his life. The story of the Alamo and Crockett's death there spread throughout the United States, inspiring many Americans to support the Texian cause. Just a few weeks after the Alamo fell, Sam Houston led the Texian army to victory over Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, securing independence for Texas. The battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," helped inspire the Texians to their decisive victory. From a poor farm boy in Tennessee to a congressman who stood up to a president to a martyr for Texan independence, Davy Crockett lived a life that embodied the frontier spirit. His willingness to stand up for what he believed was right, even when it was unpopular, set him apart from many of his contemporaries, and his legendary status as a frontiersman, politician, and American hero continues to this day. You find yourself sinking deeper into your bed, your breathing slow and steady. Your mind drifts with the story, imagining the wild landscapes of the frontier, the courage of the men and women who ventured into unknown territories. Your body feels pleasantly heavy, comfortably supported by your bed as we continue our journey through the American frontier to meet another remarkable character who blazed trails into the unknown. As we continue our journey through the American frontier, your body feels pleasantly heavy against your mattress. That cozy weight in your limbs feels so good, so right. The gentle warmth of your blankets creates a perfect cocoon of comfort as we follow the paths of those who mapped the wilderness. While Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett became legends in their own time, there were other frontiersmen whose ambitions went beyond exploration. Some dreamed of not just discovering new lands, but ruling them. One such man was John C. Fremont, a complex character whose life story reads like an adventure novel with political intrigue mixed in. Fremont was born out of wedlock in 1813, a fact that would have caused serious social stigma at the time. His father was a French immigrant who died when John was young, and his mother raised him in Charleston, South Carolina. Despite his humble beginnings, Fremont received an education and showed a talent for mathematics and surveying. Unlike Boone and Crockett, who learned their frontier skills through necessity and hard living, Fremont came to exploration through a more formal route. In 1833, at the age of 20, he joined the United States Navy and became a mathematics teacher aboard the USS Natchez. Imagine life on a naval vessel in the 1830s, wooden decks swaying beneath your feet, the constant smell of salt water, tar, and unwashed bodies. Hammocks strung below decks where men slept in shifts, the air hot and thick with the breath of dozens of sailors. The close quarters and strict discipline of naval life were a far cry from the freedom of the frontier, but they taught Fremont valuable lessons about leadership and precision. He spent the next few years exploring the coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, learning how to survey and chart new territories. The skills he developed, using instruments to measure angles and distances, creating accurate maps of unknown areas, navigating by the stars, would serve him well in his later explorations of the American West. Fremont was discharged from the Navy in 1838 and moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked as an assistant to the chief clerk of the U.S. Bureau of Topographical Engineers. This position connected him with important figures in the government and scientific community. One crucial connection was with Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, a powerful politician who strongly supported westward expansion. Benton had a beautiful daughter named Jessie. She was well-educated, politically savvy, and just 16 years old when she met the dashing 28-year-old Fremont. Despite her father's initial objections to the match due to their age difference, Jessie and John fell deeply in love and eloped in 1841. Far from being angry about the elopement, Senator Benton soon became Fremont's strongest supporter. With his father-in-law's political backing, Fremont was appointed to lead several important exploring expeditions to the Western Territories. You shift slightly in your bed, feeling the pleasant weight of your body sinking deeper into the mattress. The pillow cradles your head just right as we continue our journey through the American frontier. Fremont's first major expedition began in 1842 when he was tasked with exploring and mapping the Oregon Trail as far as the South Pass in Wyoming. The Oregon Trail was a 2,170-mile route that stretched from Independence, Missouri to Oregon's Willamette Valley. It was the main pathway for American settlers heading west, though at this time it was little more than a rough track through wilderness. Imagine setting out on such a journey. Your belongings are packed into a wagon drawn by oxen, sturdy, slow-moving animals that can pull heavy loads but require constant attention. The wagon itself is not the comfortable Conestoga wagon often depicted in movies, but a simpler farm wagon covered with canvas to protect your supplies from the elements. The wheels creak and groan with every rotation, a constant soundtrack to your westward journey. You rise before dawn each day, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten as you build a fire to cook a simple breakfast of bacon and cornmeal mush. The smell of wood smoke and frying pork fills the air, mingling with the earthy scent of prairie grass wet with dew. By the time the sun crests the horizon, you're already on the move, walking alongside the wagon to spare the oxen your weight. The trail stretches endlessly before you, cutting through vast prairies where the grass grows higher than your head in some places. Mosquitoes and flies buzz constantly around you and your animals, an irritating cloud that no amount of swatting seems to diminish. In the distance, you might spot a herd of buffalo, thousands strong, the ground trembling beneath their massive weight. At night, you circle the wagons not for protection, as the movies suggest, but to create a corral for your animals. You sleep under the stars, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a glittering river. The night air grows cold, even in summer, and you pull your blanket tighter around you as coyotes howl in the distance. This was the life Fremont and his expedition experienced as they charted the Oregon Trail. But unlike the settlers who would follow this path, Fremont had a scientific purpose. He carried precision instruments to measure latitude and longitude, barometers to record atmospheric pressure, thermometers to note temperatures, and other tools of the surveyor's trade. With these instruments, he created detailed maps and reports that would guide thousands of settlers in the years to come. Fremont was accompanied on this and later expeditions by Kit Carson, another legendary frontiersman we'll hear more about soon. Together, they explored the Rocky Mountains, confirmed the existence of the Great Salt Lake, and mapped much of what would become the American West. But Fremont's story takes a controversial turn when we look at his interactions with Native American tribes. Like many explorers of his time, Fremont's record on treatment of indigenous peoples is mixed at best and disturbing at worst. In 1844, Fremont and his expedition took over a Native American village near the Great Salt Lake in Utah without permission. The tribe, likely Shoshone or Ute, returned to find strangers occupying their homes. When they protested, Fremont's men destroyed the village and crops and killed several Native Americans who resisted. Later, during an 1845 expedition, Fremont and his men came across a group of Klamath Indians in California. When one of Fremont's horses was stolen, he ordered his men to attack the Klamath village, ending several people's lives and burning their homes. This disproportionate response to the theft of a single horse reveals the colonial mindset that valued European American property over indigenous lives. Your breath deepens naturally as you listen. Each inhale and exhale a little slower, a little more relaxed than the one before. The weight of your body feels so good against the surface of your bed, supported perfectly as we continue our journey. Despite his questionable treatment of Native Americans, Fremont was actually an abolitionist who opposed slavery. In a lot of ways, he was a confusing figure to pin down, capable of both progressive thinking on some issues and callous disregard on others. This complexity reflects the contradictory nature of American expansion itself, which brought both opportunity and devastation, depending on who you were. Fremont's most controversial action came in 1846, at the beginning of the Mexican-American War. He had been sent to California, which was then part of Mexico, ostensibly to survey the region, but his true mission, possibly given to him unofficially by President James K. Polk, was to help foment rebellion among the American settlers living there. California in 1846 was a sparsely populated territory with only about 7,000 Mexican citizens and perhaps 700 American settlers. The Mexican government was distant and weak, and many Americans believed that California would eventually become part of the United States, either through purchase or conquest. Fremont met with a group of American settlers in Sonoma, where they discussed the possibility of declaring independence from Mexico. He was cautious at first about getting overtly involved in political activities, but he did provide the settlers with weapons and ammunition from his own supplies. On June 14, 1846, the rebels raised what became known as the Bear Flag, a homemade banner featuring a crude drawing of a grizzly bear, a red star, and the words California Republic. This flag, created from a piece of white cotton cloth and some red flannel, would later become the basis for the state flag of California that we know today. The Bear Flag revolt was short-lived, however. The US Army quickly swooped in and took control of the region as part of the larger war effort against Mexico. Within a month, the Bear Flag was replaced by the Stars and Stripes, and California was claimed for the United States. Fremont's role in this revolt was controversial even at the time. He was a military officer who had acted without clear authorization from his superiors. Some accused him of trying to create his own personal empire in California. Others praised him for helping to secure valuable territory for the United States. The controversy came to a head when Fremont was court-martialed for mutiny and insubordination. He claimed that he hadn't participated in the rebellion despite substantial evidence to the contrary. The court found him guilty, but President Polk, who had possibly given Fremont secret orders to foment rebellion, commuted his sentence. Despite this setback, Fremont's career continued to flourish. He became wealthy during the California Gold Rush, was elected as one of California's first 2 senators when it achieved statehood in 1850, and in 1856 became the first presidential candidate for the newly formed Republican Party. Though he lost that election to James Buchanan, he remained an influential figure in American politics. During the Civil War, Fremont served as a Union general and made a bold move that foreshadowed Lincoln's later policies. In 1861, as the military governor of Missouri, he declared that all slaves owned by Confederates in Missouri should be free. This order, known as the Fremont Emancipation, was a significant step toward abolition in the state. The order was met with mixed reactions. Abolitionists and Unionists applauded the decision, while many slave owners and pro-Confederate sympathizers were outraged. President Abraham Lincoln was concerned about the legality of the order and its potential to drive Missouri, which was a border state, into the Confederacy. Lincoln thought that military commanders like Fremont didn't have the authority to issue proclamations of emancipation, and he feared that Fremont's actions would complicate efforts to keep the border states loyal to the Union. Lincoln was pragmatic, but still basically agreed with Fremont's anti-slavery stance. He asked Fremont to modify his proclamation, but Fremont refused. As a result, Lincoln had it annulled and replaced Fremont with a new commander. The two would later reconcile, and Lincoln appointed Fremont to a command in Virginia, where he fought against the Confederacy. But this episode highlights Fremont's independent streak and his willingness to act on his beliefs, even when it put him at odds with authority. You notice your breathing has settled into a slow, steady rhythm. Your body feels heavy and warm, so comfortable in your bed. With each breath, you sink a little deeper into relaxation as we continue our exploration of the American frontier. Fremont's partner in exploration and conquest was another legendary frontiersman, Kit Carson. While Fremont was educated and politically connected, Carson was a self-made man of the wilderness, more at home in the mountains than in civilized society. Christopher Kit Carson was born on December 24, 1809, in Kentucky, though his family soon moved to Missouri. His father died when Kit was only 9 years old, and at the age of 14 he was apprenticed to a saddle maker, but the young Carson found the routine of apprenticeship stifling and longed for adventure. At the age of 16, Carson ran away from his apprenticeship and joined a group of traders heading to Santa Fe, New Mexico. This journey marked the beginning of his life as a frontiersman. The trail to Santa Fe was dangerous, crossing hundreds of miles of prairie and desert, territory controlled by various Native American tribes who were often hostile to American travelers. Imagine young Kit Carson on this journey, a skinny teenager with a mop of unruly hair, riding a mule alongside weathered traders 3 times his age. His clothes were simple homespun cotton and leather, already dusty and sweat-stained from the trail. His fair skin quickly burned under the relentless sun, peeling and blistering before eventually tanning to a leathery brown. The traders taught him practical skills, how to track game, find water in seemingly dry landscapes, predict weather changes by watching the sky, and communicate with Native American tribes through a mixture of sign language and broken Spanish. These lessons weren't taught in any classroom but were vital for survival on the frontier. In Santa Fe, Carson found work as a fur trapper and mountain man. He spent much of his early career in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beavers and other fur-bearing animals. The life of a mountain man was solitary and dangerous. Trappers would spend months alone in the wilderness, setting their traps along cold mountain streams and living off whatever game they could hunt. The mountain men had to be self-sufficient in the extreme. They made their own clothing from the hides of animals they trapped, treated their own injuries with herbal remedies learned from Native Americans, and navigated vast territories without maps, using only the sun, stars, and their own memory of landmarks. During winter, the mountain men would gather at rendezvous sites to sell their furs to company representatives and replenish their supplies. These rendezvous became legendary events, part market, part festival, and part drunken brawl. Traders, trappers, and Native Americans would gather to exchange goods, share information about trail conditions and hunting grounds, gamble, race horses, and drink themselves into oblivion on raw whiskey. Kit Carson quickly gained a reputation as an expert guide and hunter. He spent much of his early career in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beavers and other fur-bearing animals. During this time, he also worked as a guide for expeditions into the frontier, including the 1829-1830 expedition led by Ewing Young and the 1832-1833 expedition led by Captain Benjamin Bonneville. Carson's knowledge of the Western Territories was encyclopedic. He could read the landscape like a book, knowing where to find water in drought conditions, which plants were edible, which trails were passable in different seasons, and which Native American tribes controlled which territories. This knowledge made him invaluable to explorers like Fremont, who had formal education but lacked practical wilderness experience. Carson's fame spread beyond the frontier through a series of dime novels called The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. These cheap, sensationalized books were wildly popular in eastern cities where readers were hungry for tales of frontier adventure. The Kit Carson of the dime novels was a larger-than-life hero who could outfight, outshoot, and outsmart any adversary. The real Carson was reportedly embarrassed by these exaggerated accounts, especially since he was illiterate and couldn't read them himself. Despite his lack of formal education, Carson was a man of many talents. He spoke Spanish and several Native American languages fluently. He served as an Indian agent trying to maintain peace between settlers and tribes. He fought in the Mexican-American War and later served as a Union officer in the Civil War. His life spanned a period of enormous change in the American West, from the days of solitary trappers to the era of railroads and telegraph lines. You feel a gentle heaviness in your limbs, a pleasant warmth spreading through your body. Your muscles relax more deeply with each breath as we continue our journey through the American frontier, following the paths blazed by these remarkable individuals who shaped a nation through their courage, their skills, and sometimes their ruthlessness. Your body continues to settle comfortably into your bed, that perfect feeling of being supported just right. The weight of your blankets feels so good, creating a cocoon of warmth as we continue our journey through the American frontier. Kit Carson and John C. Fremont met for the first time in 1842 in St. Louis, Missouri. Fremont was preparing for his first Western expedition and was looking for an experienced guide who knew the territories he planned to explore. Someone mentioned Carson's name, describing him as one of the best guides in the West. When they met, Carson didn't look like the legendary frontiersman Fremont had expected. He was short, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, and soft-spoken, with none of the bluster or bravado that characterized many frontier types. But there was something in Carson's clear blue eyes, something in the quiet confidence of his manner that convinced Fremont this was the man he needed. Their meeting was brief and businesslike. Fremont explained his mission to explore and map the territories along the Oregon Trail as far as South Pass in Wyoming. Carson listened quietly, occasionally asking a question about supplies or timing. By the end of their conversation, he had agreed to join the expedition for the modest sum of $100 per month. Good money in the 1840s, but hardly a fortune for a man risking his life in unknown territories. That first expedition was successful enough that Fremont requested Carson as his guide for subsequent journeys. Over the next few years, they would travel thousands of miles together, mapping rivers and mountain passes, documenting plant and animal species, and laying the groundwork for the massive westward migration that would follow. Their partnership was an effective one, combining Fremont's scientific knowledge and political connections with Carson's practical wilderness skills and experience with Native American tribes. But it was also a partnership that would lead to controversy and violence, particularly during their time in California. As you breathe slowly and deeply, feeling the gentle rise and fall of your chest, imagine the California of the 1840s. It wasn't the populous, developed state we know today. It was a remote Mexican territory, sparsely populated and largely undeveloped. The coastline was dotted with small settlements, missions established by Spanish priests, pueblos where Mexican citizens lived, and a few trading posts where American and European ships would stop to take on supplies. The interior was even less developed, vast expanses of wilderness broken only by occasional ranches where Mexican landowners raised cattle on huge tracts of land. Native American tribes still controlled much of the territory, though their numbers had been severely reduced by disease and conflict since the arrival of European settlers. Into this setting came Fremont and Carson in 1845, ostensibly on another mapping expedition, but the timing was suspicious. Relations between the United States and Mexico were deteriorating, with disputes over the Texas boundary threatening to erupt into open warfare. Many believed that Fremont's real mission was to encourage American settlers in California to rebel against Mexican rule, preparing the way for U.S. annexation of the territory. Whether or not that was his original intent, Fremont's actions certainly contributed to the outbreak of what became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. After being ordered to leave California by Mexican authorities, Fremont instead moved north to Oregon briefly, then returned to California and made contact with American settlers who were growing increasingly dissatisfied with Mexican governance. The details of exactly what happened next are disputed, but it's clear that Fremont provided encouragement and material support to a group of American settlers who seized the town of Sonoma on June 14, 1846. The rebels raised a hastily created flag featuring a crude drawing of a bear, a red star, and the words California Republic. The creation of this flag was itself a fascinating frontier story. The rebels needed a symbol for their new republic, but they had limited materials. William Todd, one of the Americans involved in the revolt, was tasked with creating the flag. He used a piece of unbleached cotton cloth about 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. For the red stripe at the bottom, he used red flannel. The star was copied from the Texas flag, and the bear was meant to represent the numerous grizzlies that roamed California at the time. The bear on the original flag looked more like a pig than a fearsome grizzly, leading some Mexican observers to mockingly call it the hog flag. Despite its crude appearance, this homemade banner would become the basis for the state flag of California that we know today. You feel yourself sinking deeper into your mattress, your body becoming pleasantly heavier with each breath. The tension in your muscles continues to melt away as we explore this fascinating period of American history. The Bear Flag Republic was short-lived. Just a month after its declaration, American naval forces arrived in Monterey and raised the U.S. flag, claiming California for the United States as part of the Mexican-American War that had officially begun in May 1846. The Bear flag was lowered, never to fly again as the symbol of an independent nation, though it would later be adopted as the state flag when California joined the Union in 1850. Fremont's role in the Bear Flag Revolt led to his court-martial for mutiny and insubordination. Though found guilty, his sentence was commuted by President Polk, suggesting that Fremont's actions in California may have aligned with the administration's unspoken goals, even if they weren't officially sanctioned. Kit Carson's participation in these events is less well documented, but he served as Fremont's trusted lieutenant throughout the period. He carried messages between Fremont and the American naval forces, scouted Mexican troop movements, and participated in several skirmishes against Mexican forces. For both men, the conquest of California represented a significant achievement in their frontier careers, though the methods they employed and the consequences for the region's Native American and Mexican populations remain controversial to this day. While Fremont and Carson were participating in the conquest of California, thousands of ordinary Americans were making their way west along the Oregon Trail. This 2,170-mile route from Independence, Missouri to Oregon's Willamette Valley was the main pathway for settlers heading to the Pacific Northwest, and after the discovery of gold in 1848 to California as well. The Oregon Trail was a treacherous journey that wasn't for the faint of heart. Over the course of America's westward expansion, an estimated 1 in 10 people lost their lives trying to find better lives in the West. That's somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 deaths in total. That's, about 20 graves per mile along the trail. There were many factors that contributed to the high mortality rates on the trail. Accidents were common: wagons overturning while crossing rivers, people falling under the wheels of their own vehicles, firearms discharging accidentally. Disease was an even bigger killer. Cholera, which causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, could sweep through a wagon train, killing dozens in a matter of days. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries could become infected and lead to death. The harsh conditions of the journey took their toll as well. Freezing cold in the mountains, scorching heat on the plains, lack of water in the deserts, all these contributed to the suffering of the travellers. Many people also suffered from malnutrition and dehydration. It was difficult to carry enough food and water for the long journey, and the lack of medical care meant that any infection was a possible death sentence. Native American attacks, while less common than popular culture might suggest, were another danger. Most tribes were willing to trade peacefully with the settlers and even provide guidance on the best routes. But as more and more whites encroached on tribal lands, conflict became inevitable. Some wagon trains were attacked, though these incidents were relatively rare compared to the deaths from disease and accident. Your breathing has settled into a slow, steady rhythm now. With each exhale, you feel a pleasant heaviness spreading through your body from your toes all the way up to your head. So comfortable, so relaxed. Despite the dangers, thousands of families packed up their belongings and set out on the Oregon Trail, driven by the promise of free land and new opportunities in the West. Their journey typically began in spring when the prairie grass was high enough to feed their draft animals, but early enough to cross the mountains before winter snows made the passes impassable. The average wagon train moved at a pace of about 15 miles per day. At that rate, the journey from Missouri to Oregon took about 5 to 6 months. That's half a year spent living in the open, exposed to the elements, with only the most basic shelter at night. The typical emigrant wagon was not the large Conestoga wagon often depicted in movies. Those were freight wagons used by professional teamsters. Most families used smaller farm wagons covered with canvas to protect their belongings from the weather. These wagons were pulled by oxen, strong, steady animals that could pull heavy loads day after day, though at a painfully slow pace. Daily life on the trail followed a predictable routine. Travelers would rise before dawn, cook a simple breakfast over a campfire, hitch up their teams and be on the move by sunrise. They would travel until midday, then stop for a brief rest during the hottest part of the day. Then it was back on the trail until evening, when they would form their wagons into a circle, primarily to keep their livestock from wandering off, not for defense, as Hollywood would have you believe, prepare dinner and settle in for the night. The food they ate was simple and monotonous. Bacon, beans, cornmeal mush and biscuits were staples. Fresh meat was available when someone managed to hunt a deer or buffalo, but hunting took time away from travel, so it wasn't an everyday occurrence. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare treats, usually obtained by trading with Native Americans or gathered along the way when travelers recognized edible wild plants. Water was a constant concern. Sometimes the wagons would travel for days between reliable water sources. When they did find water, it was often muddy, alkaline, or contaminated by the thousands of animals that had passed that way before. Many emigrants became sick from drinking bad water, adding to the toll of disease and death along the trail. One famous Wild West figure owes his life to the Oregon Trail. His parents met on it. Butch Cassidy, while not really a frontiersman, was definitely one of the most infamous personalities of the time. The bank and train robber was born in Utah in 1866 to Mormon parents who had just barely made it there. According to legend, Cassidy's parents, Maximilian Parker and Anne Campbell Gillies, both immigrated to the United States from Scotland in the mid-19th century. They met on the Oregon Trail, where they were both part of a group of Mormon pioneers traveling to the Salt Lake Valley. The group they were with almost didn't make it. They were part of what became known as the Mormon Handcart Tragedy. The Mormon Handcart Tragedy was a series of events that occurred during the mid-19th century as Mormon pioneers traveled westward to Utah. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints encouraged its members to use handcarts instead of the traditional covered wagons because the handcarts were cheaper, but it turned out to be a bad move. In 1856, two companies of Mormon handcart pioneers left Iowa City, Iowa, and headed for Salt Lake City, Utah. There were about 1,000 of them in total. They didn't time the journey very well and had to face a harsh winter as they crossed the Wyoming plains. They also had to haul their handcarts and didn't have much in the way of supplies. Many of the pioneers became sick and weak from the conditions. As their food and supplies dwindled, some of the pioneers resorted to eating the leather from their shoes and belts to survive. The pioneers pressed on though, and some were able to reach safety in Utah, but more than 200 of them died as a result of the harsh weather and lack of supplies, and many others suffered from frostbite and other injuries. Luckily for Cassidy, though unluckily for the people he killed and the owners of the banks and trains he robbed, his parents made it through the ordeal. No story about America's frontiersmen would be complete without mentioning their most important guides. While Kit Carson guided Fremont across the Western Territories, another guide played a crucial role in one of the most famous expeditions in American history, the journey of Lewis and Clark. Sacagawea was perhaps one of the most famous guides of one of the most famous frontier expeditions in history. Her story begins long before she met Lewis and Clark, though, and it's a testament to the resilience and courage of many Native American women of the time. Sacagawea had a pretty harrowing childhood. She was born into the Lemhi Shoshone tribe in what's now Idaho around 1788. Her name meant bird woman in the Shoshone language, though different spellings and pronunciations have been used over the years. When she was about 10 years old, a group of Hidatsa warriors raided her village and captured her and several other girls. The Hidatsa were a neighbouring tribe to the Shoshone, and they really didn't get along. Being captured by an enemy tribe was a terrifying experience for a young girl. Sacagawea was taken hundreds of miles from her home to a Hidatsa village near what is now Bismarck, North Dakota. There, she had to learn a new language and new customs, essentially becoming a member of the tribe that had kidnapped her. You notice your jaw has relaxed, your face feels softer, and your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm. Each breath brings a deeper sense of comfort as you listen to the story unfold. What happened next in Sacagawea's life gets a bit foggy in the historical record, but according to some accounts, she was sold or gambled away to a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau when she was about 13 years old. Charbonneau was much older than Sacagawea, probably in his mid-40s, and he already had at least one Native American wife, a Hidatsa woman named Otter Woman. Charbonneau had been living among the Hidatsa for some time, learning their language and customs while engaging in the fur trade. He saw in Sacagawea an opportunity, a young woman who could speak both Hidatsa and Shoshone, which would be valuable for a trader who needed to communicate with different tribes. Another story suggests that Charbonneau won Sacagawea in a game of chance, either dice or cards, from the group of Hidatsa men who had captured her. In this version, Charbonneau wasn't looking for wife number 2, but instead saw an opportunity to use Sacagawea's language skills to his advantage. Regardless of how it happened, Sacagawea became Charbonneau's wife and accompanied him on his travels throughout the West. By the time the Lewis and Clark expedition arrived at the Hidatsa village in the winter of 1804-1805, Sacagawea was pregnant with her first child. When Meriwether Lewis and William Clark arrived at the Hidatsa Mandan villages in present-day North Dakota, they were looking for guides who could help them navigate the unknown territories ahead and communicate with the tribes they would encounter. Charbonneau presented himself as an interpreter, and the expedition leaders hired him primarily for his language skills. But it quickly became apparent that Sacagawea was the more valuable addition to the team. She gave birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, on February 11, 1805, just a couple of months before the expedition was set to continue its journey westward. Despite having a newborn baby, Sacagawea joined the expedition when it left the Hidatsa Mandan villages in April 1805. Imagine the scene. A young woman, probably no more than 17 years old, carrying an infant strapped to her back in a cradle board, walking alongside dozens of men as they paddled canoes and hauled supplies up the Missouri River. The spring weather was unpredictable. Sunny and warm one day, cold and rainy the next. The terrain was rough, with steep riverbanks that had to be climbed when portaging around rapids or falls. Sacagawea's presence on the expedition served multiple purposes. Her knowledge of Shoshone language would be crucial when the expedition reached Shoshone territory and needed to acquire horses to cross the Rocky Mountains. Her ability to identify edible plants and roots supplemented the expedition's diet and helped prevent scurvy. And, not insignificantly, the presence of a woman with a baby signalled to other tribes that this was not a war party. No war party would travel with a woman and infant. One of Sacagawea's most important contributions came when the expedition reached Shoshone territory in present-day Idaho. As luck would have it, the chief of the Shoshone band they encountered was Kamiawait, Sacagawea's own brother, whom she hadn't seen since she was kidnapped years earlier. This fortunate coincidence helped Lewis and Clark negotiate for the horses they desperately needed to cross the mountains. Sacagawea also proved her value in a moment of crisis. The expedition was travelling down the Missouri River when their boat, which was carrying important documents, supplies and instruments, capsized in rough waters. The boat and its contents were quickly swept away by the current, but Sacagawea sprang into action. She was travelling on another boat with her infant son, saw what happened, jumped to the bank of the river, and quickly gathered up as much of the floating material as she could. Were it not for the Shoshone guide, Lewis and Clark might have had to redo the whole expedition, or at least significant portions of it. The journals, maps, and scientific specimens she saved were irreplaceable records of their journey and discoveries. Throughout the expedition, Sacagawea endured the same hardships as the men, walking dozens of miles each day, often carrying her child, sleeping on the ground in all weather conditions, facing the dangers of wild animals, treacherous rivers, and potentially hostile encounters with unknown tribes. Yet she did all this without complaint, earning the respect of the expedition members. Clark, in particular, developed a fondness for Sacagawea and her son, whom he nicknamed Pomp or Pompey. After the expedition ended, Clark offered to educate the boy in St. Louis, an offer that Charbonneau and Sacagawea eventually accepted. Your body feels so comfortable now, so heavy against your bed. Each breath brings a deeper sense of relaxation, a pleasant warmth spreading through your limbs. Your muscles feel loose and easy, completely supported as we continue our journey through the American frontier with these remarkable individuals who shaped the course of history through their courage, resilience, and unique skills. The gentle weight of your eyelids feels nice, though they remain open as the story unfolds. After the Lewis and Clark expedition returned to St. Louis in September 1806, Sacagawea's documented history becomes murkier. Some accounts suggest that she and Charbonneau settled near St. Louis for a time, accepting William Clark's offer to educate their son, Jean-Baptiste. Clark had developed a genuine fondness for the boy, whom he called Pomp, and wanted to give him the advantages of a European-American education. Other historical records indicate that Sacagawea and Charbonneau travelled to the upper Missouri River area, where Charbonneau continued to work as a fur trader and interpreter. In 1809, they accepted an invitation from Clark to settle in St. Louis, where Charbonneau was given land and encouraged to farm. But Charbonneau, a man of the wilderness rather than a farmer, sold his land after only a few months and returned to the fur trade, taking Sacagawea with him. The most widely accepted account of Sacagawea's death comes from fur company records, which indicate that she died of a putrid fever, likely typhoid fever, at Fort Manuel Lisa in present-day South Dakota in December 1812. She was only about 24 years old. Clark, who had by then become the guardian of her son, Jean-Baptiste, added a notation beside her name in his records: dead. However, some oral traditions among certain Native American tribes tell a different story. According to these accounts, Sacagawea left Charbonneau, returned to her Shoshone people, and lived to be nearly 100 years old, dying in Wyoming in 1884. This alternative narrative has gained some support, but lacks the contemporaneous written evidence that historians typically rely on. Regardless of when or how she died, Sacagawea's contribution to the Lewis and Clark expedition and, by extension, to the expansion of the United States was significant. Without her knowledge of languages, plants, and territories, the expedition might not have succeeded. She has since become an American icon, one of the few Native American women whose name is widely recognized in American history. Your breathing has settled into the perfect rhythm now, slow and deep. Each exhale releases a little more tension, allowing your body to sink even deeper into comfortable relaxation. The weight of your eyelids might feel a bit heavier, but that's a pleasant feeling too. While we've focused on specific individuals like Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, and Sacagawea, the story of the American frontier is also the story of countless ordinary people who left everything they knew for the promise of a better life in the West. The daily experiences, the hardships they endured, the small victories they celebrated, the communities they built form the true fabric of frontier history. Life on the frontier was defined by its rawness. Everything was harder, more immediate, more essential. The comforts we take for granted today, running water, central heating, grocery stores, medical care, simply didn't exist. Every aspect of survival required direct personal effort. Take something as basic as light. When darkness fell on the frontier, it was absolute. There were no streetlights, no electric bulbs, not even gas lamps in most places. The only light came from fires, candles, or oil lamps. Candles were precious commodities, often homemade from tallow, rendered animal fat, or beeswax when available. The process was labour-intensive. Fat had to be rendered, wicks had to be made from cotton or flax, and the candles had to be dipped or moulded. A single candle represented hours of work, and its light was feeble by modern standards, about as bright as a birthday candle. Most frontier families couldn't afford to burn candles for everyday activities. Instead, they organised their lives around natural light, rising with the sun and going to bed shortly after sunset. Evening activities took place around the hearth, where the fire provided both warmth and enough light to perform necessary tasks like mending clothes or carving tools. Water, too, required constant effort. There were no faucets to turn, no water heaters, no indoor plumbing. Every drop of water used in a frontier home had to be carried from a spring, stream, or well. In winter, ice had to be broken to access the water beneath. In summer, distant water sources sometimes dried up, forcing people to travel even farther for this essential resource. The average frontier family used about 5 gallons of water per day for everything. That's drinking, cooking, washing dishes, bathing and laundry combined. For comparison, the average American today uses about 8,100 gallons per day. Bathing was infrequent, maybe once a week in summer, once a month or less in winter. Laundry was a major undertaking, typically done once a month in summer and even less frequently in winter. Food preservation was another constant challenge. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly, smoked, dried, or salted to prevent spoilage. Fruits and vegetables were preserved by drying, pickling, or making them into jams and preserves. Root vegetables like potatoes and turnips could be stored in root cellars, essentially holes dug into the ground that maintained a cool, steady temperature year-round. The seasonal cycle dominated life on the frontier. Spring was for planting crops and hunting after the lean winter months. Summer was for tending crops, gathering wild foods, and preparing for the harvest. Fall was the busiest season, harvesting crops, hunting game to stock up for winter, preserving food, cutting firewood. Winter was a time of relative quiet, when outdoor work was limited by cold and snow, and families turned to indoor tasks like making tools, sewing clothes, and repairing equipment. Your body feels so comfortable now, each breath bringing a deeper sense of peace. Your muscles have released all their tension, leaving you feeling pleasantly heavy and warm. Medical care on the frontier was primitive by modern standards. Most ailments were treated at home using folk remedies passed down through generations. These remedies ranged from the genuinely effective willow bark tea for pain relief. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, to the bizarre and sometimes dangerous mercury compounds for treating syphilis, which often caused more harm than good. Childbirth was a particularly dangerous time. Women typically gave birth at home with the assistance of a midwife or female relatives. There were no pain medications, no antibiotics to prevent infection, no emergency caesarean sections for complicated deliveries. Maternal and infant mortality rates were high. About 1 in 8 women died in childbirth, and nearly 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, frontier communities developed strong bonds of mutual support. Neighbours helped each other raise barns, harvest crops, and care for the sick. Social gatherings like barn dances, quilting bees, and harvest festivals provided rare opportunities for recreation and courtship. Churches served as community centres as well as places of worship, hosting everything from school lessons to political meetings. Education on the frontier was sporadic and basic. Many children learned to read from family Bibles or almanacs, as these might be the only books in a household. Some communities established one-room schoolhouses where children of all ages were taught together by a single teacher. The school term was arranged around the agricultural calendar, with longer breaks during planting and harvest seasons when children's labour was needed on family farms. The journey west was not just a physical one, but a psychological one as well. Settlers left behind not only their homes, but their entire social networks, extended family, friends, church communities, all the familiar structures that provided support and identity. In their new homes on the frontier, they had to rebuild these connections from scratch, often with neighbours from different cultural backgrounds. This mixing of cultures was one of the defining features of the frontier. German immigrants settled alongside Irish, Scandinavian, and English. Former Northerners and Southerners became neighbours after the Civil War. Native American tribes interacted with white settlers in ways ranging from trade and cooperation to conflict and resistance. African Americans, both free and formerly enslaved, established communities and sought opportunities denied them in the East. Your breathing is so slow and steady now. With each exhale, you feel yourself drifting deeper into relaxation. Your eyelids are becoming heavier, harder to keep open. The American frontier officially came to an end in 1890, when the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier line, the boundary between settled and unsettled territory, could no longer be clearly identified. The vast territories that had once seemed limitless had been mapped, settled, and incorporated into the growing nation. But the legacy of the frontier lives on in American culture and identity. The myth of the self-reliant pioneer carving a life out of wilderness through sheer determination and hard work remains a powerful national narrative. The reality, as we've seen, was more complex. Frontier survival depended as much on community cooperation as individual effort, and the expansion that created opportunities for some came at a devastating cost to others, particularly Native American tribes who lost their lands and ways of life. The frontiersmen and women we've met in this story, Daniel Boone tracking kidnappers through the wilderness to rescue his daughter, Davy Crockett standing up for what he believed was right even when it cost him his political career, John C. Fremont mapping the Oregon Trail, Kit Carson guiding expeditions through unknown territories, Sacagawea helping Lewis and Clark navigate both the physical landscape and cultural interactions with native tribes, all embodied different aspects of the frontier experience. Their stories, with all their complexity, contradiction, and courage, help us understand this formative period in American history. They remind us that history is made not just by grand political decisions, but by individual human beings facing challenges, making choices, and living with the consequences, just as we do today. As our journey through the American frontier comes to an end, allow yourself to settle even deeper into relaxation. Feel the weight of your body against your mattress, perfectly supported. Notice how your breathing has naturally slowed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. Your eyelids are getting heavier now, harder to keep open. With each breath, a wave of peaceful relaxation flows through your body from head to toe. Your thoughts begin to drift, becoming softer, less focused, like clouds slowly dissolving in a summer sky. The frontier tales we've explored tonight begin to blend with the beginnings of dreams. Perhaps you see yourself in a log cabin, feeling the rough-hewn wood beneath your fingers, or maybe you're travelling along the Oregon Trail, the vast prairie stretching endlessly before you, or perhaps you're navigating a river in a canoe, the water glinting in the sunlight. Whatever images come to mind, let them float gently through your consciousness. There's no need to hold on to them or follow them, just observe them as they drift past, carrying you deeper into relaxation. Your limbs feel wonderfully heavy now, as if they're sinking into the mattress. Each breath brings a deeper sense of peace and comfort. The rise and fall of your chest becomes slower, steadier, as sleep begins to embrace you. The sounds around you start to fade into the background. Any thoughts that arise simply dissolve, leaving your mind clear and quiet. You're in that perfect space between wakefulness and sleep, drifting gently toward deep, restful slumber. Let go of the day completely now. Release any remaining tension or concerns. There's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to think about. Just allow yourself to be carried on the gentle current of sleep, flowing deeper and deeper into peaceful rest. Your breathing is deep and slow, your body is completely relaxed, your mind is quiet and still, and you drift and drift into a deep, restful sleep where you'll remain until morning, when you'll awaken refreshed and renewed.